Welcome to today's Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation webinar, Live Not by Lies. I'm Flagg Taylor. I'm a member of the Academic Council of the VOC, and I teach in the Political Science Department at Skidmore College, and I'm really excited to present Rod Dreher to you today, the author of Live Not by Lies. Rod's a senior editor at the American Conservative. He's written and edited for lots of publications, including the New York Post, the Dallas Morning News, National Review. It's been published a ton of places, Wall Street Journal, Weekly Standard, and many others. He's the best-selling author of a number of books, including The Benedict Option, The Little Way of Ruthie Leming, Crunchy Cons, and How Dante Can Save Your Life. The plan for today's webinar will run about an hour. Rod's going to give a very brief overview of the book, kind of to start us off, and then he and I are going to have a conversation for about, I would say, 40 minutes. We'll talk about some of the remarkable figures to whom he introduces us in the book, some of the authors whom he learned from in preparing the book, and lots of the book's themes. Again, after about 40 minutes, then I'll open up to the audience. You can submit your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And then we unfortunately have to break right around 60 minutes. So with that, Rod, I won't waste any more time. I welcome you, and I'm really glad you're here and you wrote this book. It was a pleasure for me to talk to you about it as you were researching and writing it. Why don't you give us a brief overview of the book, and then we'll have a conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Flagg, and thank you to the VOC, and thank you to all of you who are watching today, joining us on the web. The book, Live Not by Lies, started, in my mind at least, 5 or 6 years ago when I first began hearing from immigrants to the United States from communist countries who were saying that the things they were seeing happen in America today reminded them and reminds them of what they left behind. Now, this struck me at first as being an alarmist stance for them to take, but the more I started talking to them, the more I realized that they really were onto something. And also, the more I talked to them, the more I realized how angry they were at Americans, because Americans weren't taking them seriously. Americans were under the illusion that it can't happen here, even though we know from Solzhenitsyn, he said that that's the great illusion in the world today, that what happened in Russia can't happen in any other country. In fact, it can happen anywhere on earth, given the right set of circumstances. So when I began my research, I discovered by reading Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, which I think we'll be talking about in a bit, that the precursors, the conditions for the rise of totalitarianism in this country followed an eerie parallel to the conditions in pre-revolutionary Russia and pre-Nazi Germany that gave rise to the totalitarianisms there. And when I discovered this, it gave a certain foundation, like an empirical foundation to what the emigres from communism were telling me. The thing is, though, it's hard to see see totalitarianism coming here, because our idea of totalitarianism is informed almost entirely by the 20th century experience, by Nazism, by communism, and by George Orwell's 1984. In fact, the kind of totalitarianism we're going to experience, I believe, is what I call soft totalitarianism. It's a totalitarianism more in line of what Aldous Huxley had to say in Brave New World. It's going to be a totalitarianism based on manipulating not our fear of persecution and torture, but rather our desire for comfort and status. And it is also soft because it is being argued for therapeutic reasons, essentially. So we can create a safe space for everyone, and so we can go at the world and meet the world with compassion. Well, the way they're the woke, as we call them, the social justice warriors, the soft totalitarians, the world they want, you can only get the sort of compassion they want by suppressing liberty completely, I believe. And I try to explain that in my book. Another aspect that is different from what the people under communism had to deal with is the role of technology today. We have today a surveillance technology that Stalin could only have dreamed of. And the interesting thing about it is it's not so much that this has been imposed on us by the state, as in Orwell's 1984, but we have welcomed it into our lives in the form of computers, of Alexa smart speakers and smart devices, and most of all, smartphones, because it's made our lives easier. So, if you had gone to someone in the former communist world and said, "Hi, we're from the government. We would like to install a speaker in your house that will be able to listen to you, and it'll make your life much easier, but in terms of consumer convenience, but it will also let us hear what you're saying in your house." Would you take that deal? Of course they wouldn't take the deal. None of us would take the deal either. But when Amazon sells it and tells us it's all for consumer convenience, we're completely lulled into to taking that deal. And I think this is going to be terrible in terms of opening the door for soft totalitarianism. So in the book, I write about what these emigres mean when they say that we're moving towards soft totalitarianism here in America and in the West more generally. I talk about it in detail. And then I turn over the second half of the book to them. I went to the former Soviet bloc, to Russia, to Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary, to talk to dissidents, mostly Christians, who survived communism and who stood up under communism, because I wanted to find out from them, what should we learn today in the 21st century in America? How should we prepare ourselves for resisting this new totalitarianism that is coming at us very quickly? So that's basically what the book is about. And I've been so gratified, Flagg, that the book, though it has had almost no mainstream media support at all, we sold over 100,000 copies now, almost entirely on word of mouth and small events like this. And I think the reason it's selling so well is because more and more Americans are aware that something different is happening, something dangerous and wicked is coming, and they want to be prepared.
Well, that was a great introduction, and you kind of left off exactly where I want to transition to. You mentioned your travels, and one of the really great things about the book is that I think lots of educated people and people who are aware of the history of the 20th century and the history of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc in particular, lots of people will be familiar with dissidents like Solzhenitsyn or Sakharov or Václav Havel, because he became president of Czechoslovakia and then the Czech Republic after the fall of the wall. But you managed to give voice to some dissidents who have pretty much stayed out of the limelight. And so one thing I'd like you to do is maybe talk about three figures or so that you met during your travels that you found their examples particularly instructive. You could probably do a lot more than three, but we'll start there and see where we go.
Well, probably the most important two that come to mind right away were men who have died, but I didn't know anything about them until I went to Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, and started my investigation there. The first one is named Father Tomislav Kolakovic. I've dedicated the book to him because he was a prophet who sounded the alarm. In 1943, Father Kolakovic was a Jesuit working in his native Croatia in Zagreb, doing anti-Nazi work in the underground there. He got a tip that the Gestapo was coming for him and escaped the country, went to his mother's homeland, Slovakia, adopted her last name, Kolakovic, and began teaching in the Catholic University in that country. He told his students from the beginning, the good news is that the Germans are going to lose this war, but the bad news is the Soviets are going to be ruling this country when it's over, and the first thing they're going to do is come after the church. You have to be ready for them. He knew this because Father Kolakovic had studied the Soviet mindset in order to prepare for missionary work in the Soviet Union. And so what he began doing was building small groups, a network of small groups who would come together for prayer and also to talk among themselves about what was happening in their country and what they as Christians should do about it. In other words, they were preparing themselves for the day when the church would be persecuted, and they knew that they needed to lay in not only the networks of mutual support, but also the techniques that they would need to survive what was coming. Now, within 2 years of his arriving in the country, there were little Kolakovic prayer groups all over Slovakia. The Catholic bishops of Slovakia chastised him. They said, "Father, you're scaring people for no reason. You're being an alarmist. This will never happen here." but he didn't listen to them. And thank God he didn't listen to them, because when the Iron Curtain finally came down in 1948 in that country, the first thing the communists did was go after the church, go after priests, and closing down churches. Father Kolakovich had prepared clergy who were willing to listen to him, but most of all had prepared the laity for life under persecution. And that's how the underground church was launched in Slovakia. If he had not done that, if he had not gone there early to warn the people, there's no telling what would have happened to the church there. So he's a great prophet that we need to listen to today, because I think we're in a Kolakovich moment in America in which we need to use our liberty now to make these preparations. The second person on my list, Flagg, is one of his top disciples, a man named Sylvester Krčméry. Dr. Krčméry, and he was a doctor, a physician, was a Catholic layman who was the right-hand man for Father Kolakovich, along with a priest named Father Vladimir Yukol. But Dr. Krčméry was pulled off the street in Bratislava, I think in 51 or 52, and put into prison. He wrote a book in 1996, after the end of communism, called This Saved Us. That's the title in Slovak. And it was a thin memoir about precisely that, about how he and other dissidents got through their imprisonment and their torture by being faithful and not breaking. The thing I love about what Dr. Krčméry had to say is his book is very practical. He talks about the mindset that he had to take into prison so he wouldn't break. And I think this is really important. He said at the very beginning, from the very beginning, he knew that he could not let himself pity himself for what was happening, even though he had every reason to feel sorry for himself and to see himself as a victim. He had his freedom taken away. They were torturing him and everybody he knew. But he said if he felt sorry for himself, he knew that he would collapse under the strain of what was about to be unleashed on him. So he said that he decided from the beginning that he was going to be, his words, God's probe. In other words, he was going to see himself as being there in prison on a mission from God to learn what he needed to know about reality, what he needed to know about deepening his own conversion and his own repentance, and how he could serve the others who were suffering with him in prison. And that's how that man conducted himself for the next 10 years, never feeling sorry for himself, but always trying to figure out, how can I help? And he also talks about in his memoir about the spiritual exercises he did to keep himself sane, to keep his heart in the right place, to keep his heart from becoming embittered toward his persecutors, and to keep himself always praying and going deeper into his conversion. At the back of the memoir, there are transcripts of his trial in which that man gave a speech. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. A speech before the communist kangaroo court that was convened to sentence him, to judge him and sentence him for anti-state activities. He gave an incredible speech about how you have all the power, but we have God, and we are going to prevail ultimately. Stirring stuff. And that ordinary man, Dr. Sylvester Krčméry, is a model for all of us in the days to come. And the final person on my list of unheralded dissidents is a man who's still alive today, a Russian named Alexander Ogorodnikov. Ogorodnikov was born into a prominent communist family, and he himself was on the front page in the 1960s of the Komsomol newspaper, the Communist Youth Group newspaper, as a model young communist. But he eventually lost his faith in communism and discovered Christianity, Orthodox Christianity. He was in his 20s then. It was the 1970s in Russia. And he started a prayer group in Moscow that became fairly well known. And it would attract people who were desperate for something, some reason to go on living. And they would meet and they would pray, they would sing hymns, and they would talk about what was happening in their country. They knew the KGB was watching them the whole time, and eventually they were all going to go to prison, and that's exactly what happened. Because Ogorodnikov came from a prominent communist family, the government, the state, wanted to make an example of him. So though he didn't have a death sentence, they put him on death row with the hardest criminals in the Soviet Union. What he did there was began to evangelize them and talk to them about their problems and share his faith with them. And eventually they began to convert. And so the state moved him to solitary confinement. And here's where he becomes really important to us today, Ogorodnikov. In solitary confinement, he was tortured, beaten. I mean, to this day, his face is still paralyzed from the beatings he received. But he began to doubt God's providence. He began to doubt whether God was still with him and still looking at him, and because he felt totally forgotten, thrown in this hole in the gulag. He told me when we met in Moscow that God sent him visions, the same vision. Night after night, an angel would come to him, and it wasn't a dream, it was a real vision. He said, come to him and show him men, prisoners being led to their execution by the guards on either side. He couldn't see the faces of the men, but he could see their arms bound behind them. And Ogorodnikov, he couldn't understand it at first, but he began to realize that these were men with whom he had shared the faith and who had become Christians. They were going to their death because they were under a death sentence, but they were going to be in paradise eternally because Ogorodnikov had been there to share the faith. And as Ogorodnikov was talking about this, he began to cry. And because he said at that moment he regained his faith in God, and he had an assurance that there was reason for his suffering, that God had brought him there for a reason, much like Dr. Kirchmary, the attitude he took into prison. And Ogorodnikov went on to say that he kept doing that, and he eventually was released from prison after the intervention of Prime Minister Thatcher and President Reagan with Gorbachev. And to this day, Ogorodnikov continues his activity in Russia, evangelizing and speaking out for the poor and the oppressed. I think he's such a great example, though, because he shows us that there is ultimately reason behind our suffering, and that if we unite our suffering to God and we continue to serve in love and with compassion for those who are also suffering around us, that we can and will overcome.
Oh, that's wonderful. What's the date, Rod, just on when his prayer groups were operating, and then when he got sent to prison?
Early 1970s, the prayer groups, and he was sent to prison, I believe, in 78.
Okay.
I interviewed somebody else in Moscow who was part of that prayer group, a man named Viktor Popkov. Popkov was not raised with any religion at all, but he told me that around the early 70s, he began to despair of any reason to live because life was completely flat and empty and dry in the late Soviet Union. And he heard about this prayer group and began to go see what was going on there. And he said that inside those little prayer meetings in Moscow, that was the only place there was any life to be had at all, in his view. He said, again, we knew the KGB was watching us and there would be a price to be paid, but going there and being with fellow believers who knew the truth and who were not afraid to get together to praise God and just be together and be free, that was the thing that gave us hope to go on. And similarly, I'll say real quick, Flagg, another man that really jumped out at me as having something powerful to say was a Slovak historian named Jan Samulčík. He was part of the underground church in the 1980s as a college student. He and a small cell of fellow Catholic college students participated in a cell that helped distribute samizdat prayer books and things like that. When I went to Bratislava, Jan Samulčík met me and took me into a hidden chamber underneath an ordinary house in suburban Bratislava where they produced the samizdat. And he told me, Jan did, that he found freedom in small groups. And the 3 or 4 young men he would join every week there at the house, knowing that if the secret police had found out what they were doing, they would all go to prison. They risked their freedom and even their lives to come there and serve God and serve the church by getting the samizdat out. And he said that over the years, we learned how to be courageous together. We learned how to be virtuous together in taking those risks and learning to trust each other. That was the only place we knew real freedom in communist Czechoslovakia. And he said those risks that we took gave us the strength and built us up in courage, so that when the underground church in 1988 called what's now called the candle demonstration, in other words, they called for all the members of the underground church to show up on the main square in Bratislava with candles one night to pray. 10,000 people showed up. The government wasn't expecting it. They didn't know what to do. They sent in water cannons. You can see the video online. But Jan told me that he found the courage, and he knows others found the courage to go out there and stand in the public square, make the first demonstration since the 1968 Soviet invasion. But he found that courage, first of all, in those small groups. So I tell that story because it's so important to us today to start forming these small groups now of Christians and other dissidents that we can trust. So when the time comes for persecution, we'll know who we can trust. We'll know with whom we can find freedom, and we'll be able to build our own courage up.
That's great. So yeah, I encourage everyone to get the book and learn more about these really, really just impressive figures that have been somewhat forgotten by history until Rod has sort of given them the limelight they deserve.
Well, Flagg, if I can say real quickly, one thing that's interesting about them is when we think of people like Solzhenitsyn or Havel or Sakharov, as you mentioned, these are moral giants that are so, they've entered history into the pantheon of world historical heroes. They can seem almost unapproachable. But people like Dr. Kirchmary and the followers he still has today in the survivors of the underground church, people like Jan Samulchik, people like Alexander Ogorodnikov, they're still with us. They're flesh and blood people who are also great in what they did. But because they're unknown in the West, we can maybe relate more clearly to them or more easily to them than to greats like Solzhenitsyn.
Yeah, that's great. Good reminder. So let's move and talk for a few minutes just about some of the reading you did in preparing the book. In addition to interviewing people and learning people's stories and experiences, you consulted some of the great literature of the 20th century on totalitarianism. You've already mentioned Solzhenitsyn. Who do you have there?
I have Hannah Arendt.
Hannah Arendt.
The origins of totalitarianism.
Yeah, so let's maybe mention, take one or two authors, and some that people might know, but maybe mention an author that you suspect might be as not well known.
Sure. Well, Arendt was so important because, as I said, she helped me understand that these are not just frightened people making rash judgments, the emigres who are telling me that they're seeing the same things happen. What I learned from reading The Origins of Totalitarianism was that totalitarianism didn't just emerge from nowhere, that it emerged out of particular social and cultural conditions, both in Russia and in Nazi Germany. Arendt's book came out in 1951. As everybody knows, she was a German Jewish refugee from Hitler's Germany. And she set out to understand after the war how exactly both Germany and Russia had given themselves over to totalitarianism, both of the right in the Nazi case and the left in the case of communism. And she found that they had certain conditions in common. When I read her list, I was really shocked because we're dealing with that also where we are. Arendt said that the most important factor leading to totalitarianism was mass loneliness and alienation. People in those countries who had their whole ways of life destroyed by the war and by the depression, by various forms of suffering. They had lost confidence in their institutions. They didn't know what to do with themselves. And they were alienated from each other, often from their families in some cases. And anyway, they were sitting ducks for the totalitarians who marched in there and said, hey, we'll give you a way to satisfy your inner longings for meaning, for purpose, for vengeance, in the case of Germany against the Allies who imposed sanctions on them, and in the case of the proletariat against the exploiters and the czarist regime. We'll fix it for you. We'll make everything right. Well, they were lies, but they were lies that appeal to people who were suffering. In our country today, I was astonished to find this out when I was doing research. Loneliness is an enormous problem. Arendt talked about in her book about how we're suffering from mass loneliness in the West. In 1951, she wrote that at a time that we now, from our bowling alone perspective, we look back to the 50s as a golden age of American communal solidarity. It's vastly worse today. The internet has made it worse. COVID has exacerbated that. Just before COVID, Cigna, the health insurance giant, did a survey to find out how people were dealing with loneliness, if people felt lonely. An astonishing 68% of Americans call themselves lonely, 68%. And the number among young people is highest of all. It's like 79%. That is the basis within which a totalitarian leader or ideology could take root. Other things Arendt found out was that totalitarianism arose when people in those societies quit following the truth or quit looking for the truth and instead chose to prefer to believe whatever was said and spoken that fit their own prejudices. I found that to be really interesting now because we could see the same thing on the left and the right today. Also, she said people in the elites in those countries were willing to accept what she called monstrous forgeries of historiography for the sake of uplifting the poor and letting in those who had been excluded, letting them come have power. They didn't even mind the elites, said Hannah Arendt. They didn't mind seeing the destruction of their own civilization as long as there could be social justice, as they saw it. I hardly need to explain that we're dealing with that here now, too, with the 1619 Project from the New York Times being one example I cite in my book, the idea of making history, even saying things that are historically false, but useful to carry out an ideological project. So there are other things that Hannah Arendt talked about, too, but it's so important to read her book because she opens your eyes to things that are happening right here, right now, that may not bring Hitler or Lenin to us, but could bring some other totalitarian more suited to our times. Another person, a much less well-known person, at least well-known to most Americans, not to you, Flagg, is Václav Benda. Václav Benda was the only Christian, he was a Catholic, the only Christian in the inner circle of Václav Havel and the other Czech leaders. He and his wife, Camilla, were very influential in leading the dissident community in Czechoslovakia. Our listeners might not know that you edited the English language version of Václav Benda's collected essays. What I find so interesting and important about Benda is he was not just content to point out the evil of communism. He said that, and for him, this was a matter not only of intellectual and moral integrity, but of Christian integrity. He said, we can't just say what's bad. We have to figure out what's good and what we can do, even though we're powerless, how we can respond to totalitarianism. So he came up with this idea of the parallel polis, a community that runs alongside the totalitarian community in which some form of honest life can happen, even under conditions of persecution. And also his wife, Camilla, because I find it hard to separate the two. They were so close. His wife, Camilla Bendova, she was important to the resistance in the way she carried out her hospitality. The Benda's apartment in Prague is around the corner from where the secret police headquarters were. Whenever people would be called in for interrogation to the secret police, often they would stop at the Benda's apartment for tea, for prayer, to get themselves built up, and for advice on how to resist interrogation. And when they would leave, shaken from their interrogation, they would stop at the Benda's, and Camilla and the others would build them back up after their experience. Camilla also, I was talking to her about how she and her late husband, Václav, built their family up to resist persecution. And one of the things she said, I find this it just resonated so deeply in my heart. She said that she read to them, those kids, their 6 kids, 2 hours every day, no matter what, even when her husband was in prison. I said, what would you read to them? She said the classics, things they couldn't get in the communist schools. She said, I'd read to them myths. I would read to them a lot of Tolkien. I said, why Tolkien? She said, because we knew that Mordor was real. And she went on to explain that her kids couldn't understand communism. They didn't really understand the realities of what their parents and their parents' friends were struggling against. But the kids could understand what the Fellowship of the Ring was. They could understand the mission that Frodo and Gandalf and all the others were on to fight evil. And they were able to analogize from that to what their parents were doing and what they themselves were called to do. The more I thought about what Camilla told me, the more I saw how important it was, because she and Václav Benda both worked to build that family up. Václav would show them films. High Noon was a really important movie for them because they wanted to fill the moral imagination of those children with the things they would need to resist as they got older. So in other words, as I said, it was not just enough to point out what was bad in the world, but they had to give the kids something to draw on that is good, true, and beautiful, so they would not forget who they were. The late Roger Scruton, Sir Roger, said that, he told me, because he knew them all well, the Bendas and the Czech resistors, he said that that was a huge thing for Václav Benda and the others. They were desperate to hold on to cultural memory. They knew that the communists and all totalitarians, they try to control people by controlling what they know about each other, and about themselves, their memory of what it meant to be a people. And if they, the dissidents, could keep cultural memory alive, then they had a chance of surviving communism. The fact that Václav and Camilla Benda did that in very concrete ways, I try to talk about this some in my book, makes them incredibly important examples for us today. And I'd love it if you could speak about the Bendas, because you know them much better than I do.
Sure, and maybe I'll kind of connect a point that I'll make about Václav Benda to kind of lead into a question for you. So yeah, if viewers are interested, the anthology of Benda's essays in English is called The Long Night of the Watchman. And they're, they make great reading and are interesting for all the reasons that Rod has already discussed. So one interesting thing about Benda is he got involved in this organization called Charter 77 after it was formed, and then he was at the foundation of a kind of sister organization, VONS, VONS is the Czech acronym, that was called the Committee for the Unjustly Persecuted, and so. Václav and Camilla would try to, along with some of their dissident comrades, would try to, help people who were persecuted by the regime and couldn't feed themselves or had legal trouble. They would try to pay for legal fees and all these things. And one thing I found interesting about Benda is that he worked very closely with a guy named Peter Uhl in that organization. Peter Uhl was a Trotskyite, so you had this conservative Catholic and this Trotskyite Peter Uhl working together to resist the regime. And from all accounts, from what I've heard from the Benda family and others, it was a great relationship, and they worked together quite well. So my question to you, Rod, is your book is subtitled "A Manual for Christian Dissidents." Is there something in this Benda model, right, of being able to work with otherwise very ideologically incompatible people, that we should learn and try to imitate, insofar as I assume the Christian dissidents, if the soft totalitarianism gets worse, Christian dissidents are going to need the help of a lot of non-Christians. And so what do you say? What do you say in the book about that question?
I'm so glad you asked that question, Flagg, because I write as a Christian for fellow Christians. That's my audience, but I've been incredibly gratified to find that the book has developed a readership outside the Christian community. Barry Weiss is a left-wing Jewish lesbian, incredibly brave woman, quit the New York Times in protest of their inability to tolerate people who dissent from wokeness. Barry and I become friends because she has become a champion of Live Not by Lies. She told me after she read the book, she said, she got in touch with me, and she said, if you had told me 2 years ago that I would ever be on the same side as Rod Dreher on an issue, I wouldn't have believed you, but here we are. And I feel the same way, that similarly, Brett Weinstein and his wife, Heather Heying, both atheists on the political left. They were driven out of their college, Evergreen State in Washington, by a woke mob. They've taken the book up too. They did a whole podcast where they read from Live Not by Lies, and they saw in the struggle that these Christians I profile in my book, they saw something for themselves that they can take from it too. And I think this is how it should be, frankly, that Camilla Benda told me that when I asked her in their apartment in Prague, I said, look, the Czech dissidents around Havel, they led very colorful sexual lives. You know, they were always trading partners and all that, very unconventional. How was that for you and your husband? Because you're very serious Catholics. And she said, we put it aside because she said, when you're facing the kind of thing we were all facing, the kind of evil power we were facing, you realize how rare it is to find anybody who had the courage to stand up to it. Certainly most Christians would not. They just kept their heads down. Camilla said, when you found people with the courage to stand up and say, this is wrong and I'm going to stand against it, they had to be your friends. And they were willing to take you as their friends, even though under normal conditions, you might have even been opposed to each other. But the unity that they found in facing down communist totalitarianism was greater than what kept them apart. And I think this is absolutely true for us, whatever totalitarianism we are going to be facing. We can't afford to be prissy and stand only on our own political side or in our own church denomination. We have got to make allies wherever we can. And I would say this also to my secular friends, my Jewish friends, Muslim friends, anybody who stands up against wokeness. I'll be your friend. You know, you may not agree with my religion, you may not agree with all my politics, but the important thing right now is to find the courage to come together and stand against this totalitarianism. And that is, we don't have the luxury anymore of standing on the things that divide us in this current moment. And the Bendas did a fantastic job of living that out.
That's great. Why don't we maybe do, let's see, one more question or two more questions, depending on the length of your answer, and then we'll get to the audience Q&A. I'll just remind the audience now, you should submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I see we've got a few already, but keep them coming, and we'll get to as many as we can. So Rod, we've known each other for a few years now. I remember talking to you, gosh, it must have been 4 or 5 years before the book, The Benedict Option, and you were struck by the notion of what Havel called anti-political politics, and the extent to which that was a kind of model for moving away from the kind of conventional way of thinking about politics that you had resisted in your first book. And so this is just kind of a big question for you. How do you see the themes of this book fitting with the Benedict Option? Are they kind of go together, and in what ways do they go together? How do you see your work kind of shaping itself now?
Well, they go hand in glove. I didn't plan it that way, but you'll notice, Flagg, that as far as I can recall, the only characters who are both in the Benedict Option and Live Not by Lies are Václav Benda and Václav Havel. And there's a reason for that. And I quoted Benda and Havel on anti-political politics and living in truth in the Benedict Option, because the Benedict Option is something, it takes the broader picture. It talks about how can we live as faithful Christians in a post-Christian and increasingly anti-Christian society. And what I was trying to do in that book is wake up my fellow Christians to the fact that we are no longer a Christian society, despite what many of us prefer to believe. And it's not because there are no Christians anywhere, clearly there are, but it's the idea that we don't see ourselves as a society anymore as understanding ourselves by the Christian story. And I talk about in the book, in Benedict Option, about how conventional politics are not going to save us. And I think this is a big problem for so many conservative American Christians like I am. We tend to think that, if we just get the right politicians in office, if we just get the right judges on the bench, then everything will be okay. I argue in the book, no, it's not going to be okay, because our problem is not primarily political, it's cultural, and it's ultimately religious. And we Christians have allowed our own inner understanding of what it means to be Christian to decay, and as we've been assimilated into bourgeois comfort. So the Benedict Option is an argument for ways we can live to be countercultural Christians. And I took up Benda's idea of the parallel polis as an example we can follow, and also Havel's idea of living in truth. Now, Live Not by Lies is a much more focused book than the Benedict Option. It focuses specifically on totalitarianism, soft totalitarianism, and persecution. And I didn't seek generally how we can live as Christians just to be more faithful Christians in an anti-Christian society. I saw it in this book to be, how can we, under persecution, stay faithful to the truth, and including the truth of our faith? And so they're complementary books, but different books. The Live Not by Lies is a more urgent book. And I think the reason it has sold even better than the Benedict Option is because Live Not by Lies came out last fall, September 29th of last fall, after, amid all the breakdown of 2020, all the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter riots, of COVID, of increased wokeness, aggressive wokeness moving and taking over all institutions. It was a more revolutionary moment. But Benedict Option appeared as these things were happening, but they weren't quite as well known, or people weren't as aware of them. I met a pastor from Portland, Oregon last fall at an event in Nashville, and we were both speaking there, and we were in the green room. He goes, "Oh, you're the guy who wrote the Benedict Option." I remember when that came out, so many people in my community said, "Oh, Dreher's just being alarmist." Now, given what's been going on 3 years later, people now we're living the Benedict Option because there's no option but that for us. And the pastor said, "This is happening to us in Portland, Oregon. What's happening there is going to be happening all over the country in the next 10 years. And Christians and other dissidents need to get ready for that." Well, Live Not by Lies is, I hope that the people who read that it leads them to the Benedict Option, because the Benedict Option is a broader and deeper picture of what we have to do.
Great. All right. So let's get to some audience questions now. We've got a really good, deep question here. How would you describe the anthropology of man that undergirds soft totalitarianism? Where did it originate from? So we're going to get deep and philosophical for a minute.
How much time do we have? I would say it's basically this. It sees man as having no intrinsic nature. Man is completely materialistic and self-created. I think transgenderism and transhumanism, which is the coming thing too, they are the ultimate manifestations of this anthropology, because they believe that we can do whatever we want with the human being. Humanity can be whatever we want it to be, and it also sees man as socially created. Now, when you have the social justice crowd talking about gender as a social construct, this comes out of an anthropology that sees human nature as something not given, but self-created and self-willed and imposed by society. I think it comes out of Rousseau, ultimately, the idea that we are all good and society makes us evil. And Marx built on this as well. And I think that, if we don't understand that this is ultimately an anthropological fight, as well as ultimately a spiritual fight and a cosmological fight, we're going to lose. This is and it's something too, this anthropology that has taken over in capitalism as well. And this is why I think one reason that we struggle to see the totalitarian nature of what's coming. In our consumerist, capitalist, hedonistic world, we're essentially materialist. Not you and I necessarily, but that's the basic outlook in the world around us. We believe that there is no intrinsic meaning in anything, that not in human nature either. And we live to be pleased. We live to master the world. We live to use technology to bring all parts of human life and the natural world under our mastery, the mastery of our will, the triumph of our will. That is the ultimate damnation that's going to come through this totalitarianism. We have got to be able to live with suffering. I tell in the book a story about how the inability to suffer, or to even withstand any discomfort, much less suffering, is at the root of this. I was in Budapest traveling on the tram with my translator as I was going around to interview people who had been dissidents under communism. And she's 29 years old. She was pregnant, been married 5 years. And she mentioned to me that she's a Catholic, and she has so much trouble trying to talk with even her Catholic friends about the struggle she's going with now. She said that I'm married, I'm happily married, but my husband and I struggle like young marrieds do, and I have a little boy at home, one on the way, and that's difficult sometimes. But when I start trying to talk to my friends about the struggles I have, they shut me up and say, well, just leave your husband or put your kid in daycare. You be you live your own truth. She said, I keep trying to tell them, wait, I'm happy being married, but it's hard sometimes. But they don't understand this. They see any struggle as being a grave evil that you have to put away from yourself. I looked at her and said, sounds like you're trying to fight for your right to be unhappy. She said, that's it. Where did you get that? Pulled out my phone, chapter 17 of Brave New World, because that was the core of the totalitarianism in Brave New World. They subjugated everybody in that society because people just wanted to be comfortable. They said, the world controller, Mustafa Mann, says to the dissident, John the Savage, says, look, you have all the sex you want. We have drugs to make you happy all the time. You're entertained constantly. What's not to like? He calls it Christianity without tears. And the dissident said that he said, I want sin. I want God. I want love. He wants the possibility of suffering, because only in suffering can we be free and can we be truly human. So the dictator says, be my guest. You're welcome to it. That anthropology that says that the only way we can be fully human is to have all our anxieties taken away from us and to be completely comfortable is going to be the thing that undoes us. I think Flannery O'Connor said, tenderness leads to the gas chamber, and that's what she meant.
All right, so I have two questions here that are very close, so I'm going to try to kind of combine them. So one question is wondering whether it's really possible to fight the woke theology, or is it so late that we're really relegated to finding underground spaces? And then another questioner asks, how can people work against the creep of soft totalitarianism in institutions that have been so ideologically captured, nonprofit, academic, labor? So it's an interesting dynamic there between those two questions. Are we better suited to go underground and create alternative institutions, or to what extent should we really resist within the institutions that we think are still possible to maintain despite their capture?
Great questions. And I think I'm more pessimistic on this and say, let's build the underground, precisely because all the institutions in the society have been captured. Even the military has gone over to wokeness. As if you're a viewer of Tucker Carlson, you'll know this, that they have been captured by the woke. I don't want to discourage people from getting involved in politics to try to fight this. Because we have to try to fight as hard as we can for our liberties for as long as we can. But I'm discouraged about the prospect of any kind of victory, in part because the soft totalitarians do control all the high ground in society, and therefore they're gatekeepers into the professions. The middle class, unless the middle class in America is willing to suffer for the sake of truth, then we're going to lose. Because the woke are going to make it impossible to participate fully in society unless you sign off on what they want you to believe. And I think also that we are not prepared as Americans to do that. I wish it was not true, but it is true. I talked a few years ago to a friend of mine who's a Christian college administrator out in California. And a few years ago, there was a move by the state legislature to take away Cal grants from so-called bigot colleges. Now in California, there's a state plan to grant money to needy students that they can use for their college educations at any accredited institution in the state. Well, the head of the LGBT caucus in the state legislature said, we want to make this impossible for them to use at religious institutions that discriminate against LGBTs. Well, there was a big fight underway because of that. And this college administrator friend of mine, who's an evangelical, went down with some others to the big evangelical churches in Southern California to try to raise support, to stand up to protect the religious liberty of these colleges. He said nobody would do it. None of these pastors in these rich well-populated churches in Southern California and Orange County would do it because they were terrified of being called bigots and how this would hurt their middle-class status and their jobs. He said the only way this got defeated was the Black Pentecostal pastors of Southern Los Angeles and the Hispanic Catholic Archbishop of Los Angeles stood with them, and they beat back this measure for now. My point is simply this, that if we are not prepared to suffer serious consequences for the sake of our faith, then we are going to be crushed. To this point, I have seen no reason to believe that there's going to be an uprising in America of liberty-loving people, Christian or otherwise, who are willing to turn this back. I hope I'm wrong, but we don't have the time to keep playing this out and hoping that we can turn this around. Let's do both things. Let's fight politically as hard as we can, but also prepare the underground for the days when we can't resist anymore. And I'd add one more thing. I talk about this in the book. I believe that totalitarianism will come to this country and be administered not by gulags and secret police, but rather by something like the Chinese social credit system. We don't have time to really get into the details of the social credit system here, but it is something administered by the Chinese state that keeps track of every single Chinese citizen and what they do online, where they go, who they meet with. All of this is tracked and trackable by electronically in China. And they give you a social credit rating to basically tell people, are you a trustworthy citizen? If you do good things like download the speeches of Xi Jinping, you get higher ratings, you can participate more fully in society and the economy, travel as much as you want, go to the best restaurants, etc. If you do bad things like go to church or meet with dissidents, people like that, people with low social credit scores, the government knows this, and you get a lower score, and that restricts you. Eventually, if you get a low enough score, you can no longer buy or sell or participate in the economy. You are a non-person. We have the technology to do that in America today. People don't realize this, but we are being tracked constantly, not by the government, but by business through our apps on our smartphones, on our GPS, and so forth. They know what we do, and they know what we do, so they can sell us things. It's not going to take a lot for the government to convince the American people through propaganda in the compliant media and through big business, especially big tech, that to stop domestic terrorists, we need to have a social credit system. This is the thing that I'm afraid of. And if we're not preparing for ways to evade that now, we're going to be lost when it kicks in.
All right, here's an interesting one. What does a Kolakovich group set against soft totalitarianism look like? Is the battle against voluntary technological capitalism necessarily spiritual, or could it be mostly covered by secular works, for example, Neil Postman's?
Mm-hmm. I don't know what a Kolakovich group in our society would look like because I've not seen one. I think that Kolakovich had a very simple method for analyzing the problems there. He got this from a Catholic youth workers movement in Belgium in the 1920s. It had 3 points: see, judge, and act. To see meant he would get people together and have them talk about what was going on around them and get a picture, an analytical picture of conditions, actual conditions in their society. To judge is what they did when they would discuss the facts around them and their possibilities for resistance and to try to figure out what they had to do. And to act was to leave the room and go out into the world and implement what they had decided they needed to do. This method, he said, could be used anywhere. And I think we could use it in our own society too. Even though we may not be doing things like the Kolakovich group did, one of the things they did was to learn how to resist an interrogation. I honestly don't think we're going to have to deal with that here. But so I wouldn't want to tell people to start doing that. But I think we'll have to do things like take very serious measures to renegotiate and redefine our relationship to social media, a la Neil Postman. I was talking to this one Orthodox Christian I know who was he had been in military intelligence, retired from military intelligence, and he says it's absolutely true that the government is collecting all electronic communications and storing it in these vast repositories out in the desert of Utah. This is not conspiracy theory. This has been written about. The CIA has talked about it. Well, he said it really is true. And so we dissidents need to figure out, how are we going to communicate non-electronically if that becomes necessary? This is the sort of thing that the Kolakovich groups can be working out among themselves. We have to be creative and figure out how to apply the insights of Father Kolakovich and these other dissidents to our own time and place.
All right, so I'll try to get some, we only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to try to get some questions that can be answered rather quickly. So one questioner is asking about, she has some children who are now getting older. They were raised, some of them homeschooled and Christian, but now becoming subject in a congregation to more social justice stuff. They won't read anything from the right. And so what would you recommend as a book to give such people? If they sort of have this antipathy towards anything that smacks of right wing, what could they read that might, wake them up to what you've been talking about?
I would hate to think that the left would not read the Gulag Archipelago today. Solzhenitsyn is a hero, a world hero, not just a hero of conservatives. I would have them read that. I would say, Flagg, maybe you can jump in here too. That's a great question.
Maybe the Captive Mind that you talk about?
Captive Mind, thank you.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Czesław Miłosz, Czesław Miłosz was a communist himself, communist intellectual who defected from Poland. He was a Polish diplomat. He wrote a book in 1953 called The Captive Mind, in which he talked about ways that intellectuals allowed themselves to be seduced by communism. It's a powerful book. It has so many resonances today. In fact, I said to my publisher recently, I said, you need to find somebody who can write a version of The Captive Mind to talk about American intellectuals. Miłosz was not a conservative necessarily. He was an anti-communist who knew what communism was. And that is a great place to start because they would not think that it is a right-wing book, because it's really not.
All right, another. Well, this isn't that quick, but it's on the side of quick. One questioner notes that there are many leftists who are also anti-woke and anti-cancel culture. You mentioned one of them, Barry Weiss, already. Why should we presume that things are going to get worse? Is it not the case that there more and more leftists are kind of waking up to this problem? So maybe things are going to get better. Why so pessimistic?
I mean, look around you. Look at the trends. Look at if you see patterns working in our society, you can see that there's no stopping this, or no apparent stopping this. Anything could happen, but the number of leftists who are standing up to this are minuscule compared to the number of leftists who are going along with it, and not just leftists, but normies in the middle who just don't want any trouble. I was talking to a friend of mine, two friends actually, just this week, two different friends, both part of different churches, who were talking about how frustrating it is, even though they both go to conservative churches, how nobody in church wants to hear any of this. They want to keep all bad thoughts, all pessimistic thoughts away. And they're welcoming wokeness into the churches. One of them is starting to read Ibram Kendi, which is just pure poison. And the other one, he was talking about a network of churches he works with. He said they don't want to deal with any of this stuff because it seems too controversial to them. So their congregations are being led like sheep to the slaughter because nobody wants to do the hard things and risk suffering. That, I know we're running out of time, Flagg, so I'll end on this. The main point that I got from the dissidents, and this is in chapter 9 of Live Not by Lies, is that suffering is the key to resist this. The ability to suffer, the willingness to suffer for the truth. A man named Yuri Sipko, an elderly Baptist who had been born in under Stalinism, told me, looked me in the eye on a street corner in Moscow and said, go back to America and tell the church that if you're not willing to resist, if you're not willing to suffer, your faith is hypocritical. And all of these people testified, you're not going to make it if you're not willing to suffer for truth. So that is the thing we need to recover in a very strong way in this country, in our churches and outside our churches, the ability to withstand the hatred of others, the loss of job, even the loss of our freedom, so we can live in truth.
Thanks, Rod. That was great. I know we didn't get to nearly as many questions as are in the Q&A chat function there, but I know, Rod has a blog, as many of you know, at the American Conservative, and he is very, very good about engaging with his readers in the comments. So I'm sure if you submitted a question for him there, he'd be happy to answer it. There are a couple Benda questions I saw in the chat that I couldn't get to, so feel free to email me at ftaylor@skidmore.edu. I'm happy to talk to you more about Benda and Dissent. So I apologize for the fact that we couldn't get to all these questions. Thanks again, Rod, for the presentation and for helping us understand how the experience of the dissidents under communism can help us confront the challenges of today. You all can find out more about upcoming events at victimsofcommunism.org. Follow their work on Twitter and Facebook at VO Communism. For the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I'm Flagg Taylor. It's been a pleasure. Thanks again, Rod, and thank you all again for attending, and have a great day.